On the other hand, you had the Royal Society and the Académie Française, which are both science clubs in the age of the Enlightenment, and they excluded theologians, I hope I pronounce it correct, from the discussion, so they were not allowed to participate. It's science clubs that developed, yeah, the Académie Française and the Royal Society, yeah. Oh, theologists, people, you know, religious, what is the English term for it? People who are like theoreticians for the church. When Lenin in 1908 dealt with the dilemma that those who were idealists, they had a problem because they explained the world as existing because we think it's existing, yeah. Or religious people who had this idea of a world being, I don't know, 6,000 years or 8,000 years young. And then they found all these fossils, which are obviously much, much older than human beings and much, much older than the idea of how young the world is. And this didn't work, didn't go together. So he explains that the ruling class actually tries to fight materialism because it is a danger for their idea of ruling and their power. All philosophies but Marxism are from and for the ruling class, and they are actually of little use for ordinary people. And Marxism is different because it does not only explain where the daily misery comes from, but it also explains that it doesn't have to be like this any longer and how to change it. So materialism is central for Marxists, and dialectics is as well. Marxists always used philosophy not for the sake of it, not, you know, to sit in a bar with a glass of red wine and, you know, talking whatever, but as a tool to understand the world, why things are changing, and the mechanisms how to change the world. They understood that Marxism is a science, so they used the tools of science which worked in biology, in physics, in astronomy. They used these tools and used it on human societies to develop perspectives about possible developments. We are talking a lot about perspectives this week, and perspective is neither 100% this is going to happen, nor is it a complete random everything is possible, but it's the attempt based on analyzing different factors to formulate the most likely scenarios and to prepare for them. In 1940, Trotsky explained the greatest revolution in all history was not led by the party which started with bombs, but the party which started out with dialectical materialism. When we try to understand some things, then sometimes it seems enough to look at facts and figures and use logic. And there is nothing wrong about doing that, but it's not sufficient if we want to understand and even predict developments and processes in its process of developing. It is changing with all the contradictory elements which are existing. So Trotsky explains that dialectical thinking is related to vulgar thinking in the same way that a motion picture is related to a still photograph. Since the 18th century, the development of probably the 17th, the productive forces and the development of capitalism did not fit any longer with the superstructure of the state and society and the way that society was run in an absolute monarchy. And again, Trotsky explains about the relation between that. He did this in a series of writings in 1939, where he was in a political battle to defend Marxism and the need of a proletarian revolutionary world party against petty bourgeois trends and ideas that were arguing for pragmatism and to be concrete, basing themselves mainly on empirical findings, not on Marxist research. So he says our thought, including dialectical thought, is only one of the forms of the expression of changing matter. To back to the 18th century and the changing of the modes of production, so there were big thinkers long before that, yeah, even during the darkest times of the Middle Age. But their ideas were like too early and they did not fit to the mode of production. But then it changed, and then the ideas, had the time to be there. So one of these was Hegel, who re-established dialectics and the idea of a world of contradictions that it in itself creates the future. The problem with Hegel was that he was still believing in some spiritual something. Marx and Engels did not limit themselves to dialectic in the way that it was re-established by Hegel, but they went further and they linked it with materialism, which in their time was represented famously by Feuerbach. And that's why we talk about materialist dialectics or dialectical materialism. And one cannot work without the other if you want to have a tool to change the world. The understanding in itself, the understanding that materialism emerged as a wider trend in society, this understanding itself is already rooted in dialectical materialism. So in using materialism and dialectics on history, which is then called historical materialism, it's a tool that we use to understand. Its validity is proven, for example, in the fact that predictions were made about specific findings, even when you couldn't find them at that time because you had not the tools for it. What I mean is, for example, the periodical table, with, you say, all the, oxygen and whatever, elements. Yes, that's the term, thanks. They knew there were spaces, there must be something there, but they couldn't find them at that time. But because they used the methods, they could do it. The elements in this element table. So I will now come to the three laws or principle of dialectics, which is the law of the unity and conflict of opposites, the law of the passage of quantitative changes into qualitative changes, and the law of the negation of the negation. Number one, the contradictions which are inherent in the situation are necessary, and they are in itself the push for changes. There is no life without death and no death without life. Capitalism cannot exist without the capitalist class as well as the working class, two classes which have absolutely contradictory interests, and they fight each other all the time. The second law, the basic idea is that nothing is eternal. Nothing stays the same forever. If you go on a high mountain, which really seems to be completely eternal, and then you are on top, and then you find fossils that prove that this was once under the sea. And that shows very clearly that there is a huge change. It explains that developments is not a linear process, that there are leaps, there are breaks, there are pushbacks, there are war, crises, catastrophes, developments which actually contradict our wish for a relaxed and smooth life. The idea of a permanent stability, which is often given by the ruling class, sounds something to hope for. It is an illusion, and it contradicts it's not only contradicted by reality, because we see it's not like that, but also by the laws of science and of nature and society. Any idea of Marxism being a dogma is in itself un-Marxist, as it ignores the facts that nothing is eternal. It's the understanding that the process do not develop in a straight line, but at some points there are changes in quantity that lead to a change in quality. It's the straw that breaks the camel's back. You have been putting on straw and nothing happened, and then you put the last on and suddenly it's the same you put on before it, but suddenly it collapses. It's the extra burden that health workers under Corona felt that finally was too much to take, and they resisted. It's the feeling of it can't go on like this that Lenin described as an element of a revolutionary situation, which we see in Sri Lanka. Third law, each new thing or development has elements of the old one in it. It's the one it overcome, it negated. It's like a rebirth, but on a higher level. When you buy a computer, a new one, in the last generation, then it always builds on old technology of the generations before. Marxist philosophy itself is an example for the negation of the negation, because they use the findings of Adam Smith and David Ricardo to develop the Marxist understanding of labor, of value, of profit, which in itself is necessary to overcome exactly the capitalism that Smith and Ricardo created it for. In the last 1 or 2 minutes. Lenin said, without revolutionary theory, there can be no revolutionary movement. Today, many of the philosophical findings or things that were used by Marx and Engels are much more common than they were in their times. Sorry, some of the philosophical findings that Marx and Engels found or used, which were very new and uncommon in their times, are quite common today. At the same time, the illusions of idealistic explanation is everywhere, and it's recreated every minute in the propaganda of the ruling classes. When they say it's your personal responsibility to stay healthy and to optimize yourself, when they say it's the greed of some, evil individuals like Bezos or Trump or Musk, which are behind the problems of climate or hunger. When they say we need more women in management and political leading positions to overcome sexism. We all have heard these arguments, and we have heard them often by left people or so-called left people. They are undialectical, they are unmaterialist. They are not based on science, and they are of no use to change the society. And actually, they even help to stabilize the system we are living in. So given the multiple crises we are living in, the Marxist philosophy, especially dialectical materialism, is a necessary tool. We must not look for shortcuts. We must train to use it. And Kevin will do that after I've spoken. It's necessary to understand in depth, to have everything ready for the necessary changes in society that we are fighting for.
Hi, comrades. I think what Sonia gave us a very good outline. It's good probably just before I dive into more practical demonstrations of where dialectical materialism has proved to be important, or the lack of it has proved to be important in the history of the revolutionary movement. Just to basically recap, that's it. Matter is primary. Ideas are the product of matter. Matter and ideas are unified in the human brain. There's a unity. Matter is in all matter is in a constant state of change. Dialectics are the laws that govern the change of matter. And as Sonia just said, not anything is possible at any time. That's incorrect. But at certain points in time, you can be coming close to a time when change is possible. And in particular, if a revolutionary party is able to understand quantitative into qualitative change and the potential, well, then it can fashion that change. I want to deal with the significance of I keep on getting those two, of dialectical materialism in the conflict in the Socialist Workers' Party in the US in 1939-40. Can you give me my other lead off over there? I'm joking, that's a joke. Now, this dispute in the US was in the context of the approaching imperialist war, when it was possible that revolutionaries would have to defend the Soviet Union if the Soviet Union was attacked in the course of the war by the likes of US imperialism. And some in the SWP, under the pressure of bourgeois society in America, pulled back from supporting the idea that they would defend the USSR and the planned economy, which was their previous position. So I'm going to just deal with one aspect of this dispute. In January 1939, Burnham and Shachtman, who were collaborators with Trotsky, wrote a document which was attacking others on the left who had criticized the SWP. Trotsky agreed with the political points in the document, but sharply disagreed with points that Burnham and Shachtman made about dialectical materialism. Burnham indicated that he didn't agree with dialectical materialism, and Shachtman said it's not necessary to use it in this practical political argument that we're having. And Trotsky completely disagreed with this, saying, how can you divorce your conclusions in a political discussion from the methods that you use to come to those conclusions? And this abandonment of a way of thinking of dialectical materialism made Trotsky question what was going to happen with these individuals, and that was correct. Within months, both Burnham and Shachtman were part of an opposition inside the SWP that was repeating some of the points that only a few months ago they had criticized. One of the key issues was that they had changed their position about defending the USSR and the planned economy, because they said that there had been a change, and they weren't able to show when the change had taken place, so that at one stage they defended the Soviet Union and the planned economy, and now they don't, but they weren't able to identify why, essentially, which exposed them. And Trotsky made the point that you need a concrete analysis on such questions. You're guided by dialectical materialism, but you also need concrete analysis. You need to identify what made the USSR different than capitalism. You need to identify what has happened since, and whether quantitative change has led to a qualitative change, that capitalism is now back in the USSR and there's a ruling class. Such a concrete analysis is part of dialectical materialism, but the broader laws of dialectical materialism, which Sonia has dealt with, directs the analysis along the correct paths, but they didn't have that guide any longer. They were guided by empiricism and eclecticism. From Lenin and the reaction in the Bolshevik Party to the defeat of the revolution in 1905, and the defeat began to set in mid-1907. The defeat in the revolution was reflected in the Bolshevik Party with a political crisis. There were many different elements, but one was a tendency towards ultra-leftism, which was a denial that the revolution had been defeated and just a repetition of the same tactics and approach. But then also a theoretical retreat away from the ideas of philosophy, dialectical materialism. And Bogdanov was a key component in this retreat. And Lenin wrote the book that Sonia referred to, Materialism and Imperial Criticism, about dialectical materialism, in response to 4 documents that were produced in 1908, which was pushing back on Marxist theory, as well as the demoralizing effects of the defeat of the revolution being a key factor in this retreat. Important breakthroughs in science at the time was also a factor. These included breakthroughs related to quantum theory and relativity. It was referred to as a miracle year for Einstein, where he produced 4 major papers in 1905, for example. And what flowed from some of these scientific advances was that the world was not made up of what people had thought previously, but much smaller particles make up the world. So what existed previously was blown apart, and space, time, and matter were now no longer absolutes. Now, these scientific advancements are completely in line with the concepts and the ideas of dialectical materialism. But comrades will appreciate that at the time, when they were newly discovered, they created a huge questioning, and everything then was questioned. This was a revolution in how the physical world was understood. But at the time, for some people in the Bolshevik Party, it raised the question whether physical reality actually existed. And so essentially, you had a development of religious belief, idealism, and a pushback against the fundamental materialist basis of the Bolshevik Party. And as Sonia said, without that philosophy, if it's not accepted, you have no movement. So Lenin had to come out in a fully comprehensive way and answer all of these points. I just want to give a quote from Materialism and Imperial Criticism. Destroyed the old theory of structure of matter, shattered the atom, discovered new forms of material motion. So unlike the old, so totally uninvestigated and unstudied, so unusual and miraculous. He's describing what has happened, that it permits nature to be presented as non-material. And that was basically, he, in other words, in a contemporary way, took up the different issues. Now, another example of of dialectical materialism was key, but in a positive way, was in 1914, when Lenin had to rearm the Bolshevik cadre after the huge disorientation of the sellout of the Second International in the World War. So the comrades can imagine that this was such a huge event, where the Second International for years had said it was going to fight against war, mobilize the workers of Europe, and then they suddenly just sold out. Huge shock. As it was a huge change, Lenin felt the need to analyze dialectics, and he went back and studied like never before Hegel. And apparently Lenin has thousands of pages of notes related to his study of Hegel at the end of 1914. He was writing an article about Marxism for an encyclopedia at this stage called, and I would suggest comrades would read this, it's very good. It's called Brief Biographical Sketch with an Exposition of Marxism. And he contacted the editors right at the start of 1915 and said, is it okay if I make corrections because I've done further studying? Yeah. It's called Brief Biographical Sketch with an Exposition of Marxism. It was a small pamphlet about Marx. And in the notes that Lenin wrote, I just want to give a quote to give an assessment to the comrades here about how big a shift this was in Lenin's thinking, 1914, 1915. So this is from the notes that he wrote, and it's in Collected Works. And he says, it is impossible completely to understand Marx's Capital without especially its first chapter. It's impossible to completely understand Marx's Capital and especially its first chapter without having thoroughly studied and understood the whole of Hegel's logic. And then his conclusion is, consequently, half a century later, none of the Marxists understood Marx. And then later in the notes, he says, Plekhanov and other Marxists paid no attention to dialectics. And Plekhanov is considered to be the founding father, if you want to put it like that, of Russian Marxism. Now, just to illustrate, this period was decisive. We're talking about the end of 1914 to 1915. There will be a revolution in 2 years' time. This was the essential rearming of the Bolshevik party, coming off a historic sellout and a historic defeat with the World War. Lenin had to rearm the Bolsheviks about the war. But then also after this period is when Lenin wrote Imperialism, the Highest Stage of Capitalism. It's when he wrote State and Revolution. It's when he wrote some of the key, insightful texts that prepared for the revolution. I want to give a couple of other examples, which I wasn't aware. I was generally aware, but not aware of some of the particulars and the role that dialectics played. But Bernstein is a hateful figure in the revolutionary movement. So Bernstein, as far as I understand, knew Marx. He certainly knew Engels. And would have considered himself to be a supporter. But it was Bernstein in reality that fought a battle to bring reformist ideas back or into the Second International and to debase the revolutionary content of the International. He argued that it should become a party of social reform, not social revolution. But it's not an accident that Bernstein specifically targeted dialectics. He rejected dialectics particularly. And he said, Hegelian dialectics is a treacherous element in Marxist doctrine, the pitfall in the way of logical consideration. I want to just comment about Karl Kautsky, who was referred to as the Pope of Marxism. Bit of a contradiction there, but probably appropriate. Just a very short quote from Kautsky. They, Marx and Engels, started out with Hegel. I started out with Darwin. The latter occupied my thoughts earlier than Marx. And again, I don't think that that's accidental, because essentially Kautsky's view was of an abstract automatic working out of historic processes would result in change. So Kautsky had his own particular form of false determinism, if the comrades understand. And comrades obviously are aware that Kautsky opposed the Russian Revolution. So the question of, in reality, being inoculated by Darwin or his interpretation of Darwin against revolution. Yeah. Okay. Sorry for that. I'll get the message though. Thanks. I just want to make a couple of comments to try and bring things more up to date. Personally, anti-religious propaganda was very important in my political development. I hated religion and I hated the church. And comrades will be boosted by, over the last 15, 20 years, the particular rise in an atheistic viewpoint in many societies and see it as progressive. But there's also been the emergence of some atheists who sort of like the new atheists that some speak of, like Christopher Hitchens, who's dead now, obviously, but Richard Dawkins and people of this character. And the undialectical materialist nature of their atheism has caused difficulties. We know that both of the people that I mentioned, in reality, while they definitely have made a contribution in radicalizing people and clarifying these issues, there's no question about that. But they also helped create a platform which then Islamophobia was used or launched from. And the approach that they took in terms of the way in which they argued their atheism would have been alienating for working class people who may have been affected by religious ideas. Ironically, in reality, they didn't have a materialist approach to their atheism, because what Marxism is, first and foremost, is an ability to understand why things happen. Why? So Marx and we understand why people become religious. And we don't respect it, we don't agree with it, we argue against it, but you can respect the person. I'm talking about not zealots here, obviously. I'm talking about ordinary people. But we will find, and when we are successful, for example, in Ireland, in building a base, for example, amongst the Nigerian community, we will find a prevalence of religious ideas that we'll have to deal with. And so the approach of Marxism in regard to atheism is not to boastfully, proclaim in an arrogant way being atheist, but it's about trying to explain to people and undermine religious ideas skillfully. I want to mention a couple of points about the CWI. And again, I hope I'm going to be balanced, because I see myself in the points that I will make. And I'm going to touch on this thing about sort of religion or idealist viewpoints, but also touch on what I mentioned about Kautsky and an evolutionary understanding. In my view, the way in which the CWI, as it evolved, spoke of the working class was not the same way that Lenin and Trotsky spoke of the working class. If you read Lenin and Trotsky, they don't hold back on the working class. They will call it as it is. If the working class is adopting a reactionary position, they call it, etc. Whereas the CWI was formed in a period of defending the working class against a shift away from the working class by other Trotskyist organizations. So in the DNA of the CWI was a defense of the working class, which was a good point. But over time, and particularly in the last 10, 15 years, there wasn't a critical analysis of the working class movement, and there wasn't a critical analysis of the consciousness of the working class. There was a repetition of a previous understanding. In other words, they were worshiping their previous idea as opposed to engaging in an actual analysis of where the working class was at. In What Is to Be Done, Lenin makes a point that aspects of behavior inside the Revolutionary Party are the worst ones are ones that aren't identified because they linger and you can't actually deal with them, but there's something there, an approach, an attitude, etc. And in my opinion, there was a coming together of a number of things, which meant that there was an understanding amongst many comrades, or a view amongst many comrades, that things would evolve to a better position in terms of the working class, that the working class movement, which had been knocked back, would recover. So there was going to be a recovery, sort of like in an evolutionary type way. Now, that's connected with the bourgeois ideology of the religion of capitalist progress, that there's going to be, improvements, It's linked with the concept of, a civilization, things moving forward. But in my opinion, there was definitely this expectation that the working class at some stage would flex its muscles and the whole balance of forces would be altered, and then things would be easier for us. Now, some comments may disagree that this existed, but it definitely existed in the Irish section, and I've observed it in other sections myself. And to me, it, for example, hasn't prepared us for the period that we're in now, which is much more complex, much more volatile, and much more, in a sense, violent. It was a mistaken evolutionary understanding as opposed to a genuine dialectical materialist revolutionary understanding. There was some points I was going to make about the nature of the work that we do in the party and whether it's informed by a dialectical materialist spirit, or do we lapse in terms of the sharpness of our understanding and approach? I'm not going to do that now, except to just list off some things that comrades might think about. It's correct to try and theorize, but is there a danger of us being too abstract and not concrete enough? And you should be able to be concrete if you understand the theory fully. Are there dangerous elements of formal logic operating in the way in which we think? Pragmatism, empiricism. In contrast to the point I made about being abstract, is there a danger that we're too organizational and not political enough? That we think there's organizational solutions to political problems, and we don't actually politicize the work enough. Thanks, comrades. Thanks very much, comrades. I'm going to mention a few things which are aspects of things that happen inside the organization, approaches, things of that character. One of the points that we make about the Revolutionary Party is that it all boils down to consciousness. If there's no consciousness about the importance of raising money, well then money will not be raised. If it's not in people's minds, it's not going to be raised. If there's a low level of consciousness that it's the responsibility of each and every member to recruit to the Revolutionary Party, well then we will not be recruiting in line with the potential that may exist in the objective conditions. Comrades are aware that after the split with the CWI, that we would have lost some of the comrades connected to TDU, for example, some comrades in Australia. And on behalf of the CWI, I made a number of visits to Australia, and one time I had a discussion with a particular comrade, and I can't describe the look of terror on this comrade's face when I explained that a revolutionary is thinking all the time, or should be thinking all the time, because this comrade wanted to know what to do and then go and do it, but not want to think about it, not want to reflect on it, etc. And, in that type of way, you can achieve a certain amount by unconscious, if comrades understand what I mean, determined action, but the quality, there's no quality to it. So consciousness is extremely important, and we should take ourselves fully seriously. So we need critically minded members and comrades. And in my opinion, that means that we should try and recruit people on the best basis possible. It starts right at the very start in the process of recruitment. Sometimes comrades can approach recruitment on the basis that we're trying to get somebody to agree with us. And sometimes we can actually limit the discussion, if there is agreement, happy, and that we move to recruit the person. And of course, I'm in favor of agreement, but we should try and have agreement on the basis of a vibrant, real political discussion that raises the level of the person as to what movement we are, what is a revolutionary organization, what is a revolution. Because if we undersell, well then potentially we're putting somebody on a path of development which is a low level of development as opposed to a higher level of development. And we shouldn't underestimate the capabilities of people, including young people, to grasp and to theoretically and politically understand what we're about. And we can have a slow motion, evolutionary approach, happy that somebody may be joining, but not really maximizing the potential of the person. That can come from us. In Ireland, in the recent period, we, as other sections, I think, have experienced difficulties in fully reactivating the organization post-pandemic. And comrades were just, probably more frequently contacting people and seeing could they mobilize them. But the more frequent contact doesn't result in any improvement. because we're not dealing with the reason. It's not because of a lack of information that they don't know there's an activity on. It's for political reasons, primarily. So therefore, there's a danger of a misdiagnosis on behalf of the organization, instead of understanding that a lot of people are knocked politically because of the complications of the world in which they live in. And so only a political approach that actually deals with the current political situation and demonstrates the potential that is contained in it, but which isn't obvious on the surface. It needs a deeper analysis. Those are the type of discussions that we've had to have in Ireland, and I'm sure it's potentially relevant to other sections. And comrades take this point I made earlier on about an evolutionary approach. Comrades do that unconsciously. So, for example, at a previous point inside the organization, we used to talk in a general sense about this is a favorable period or it's an unfavorable period. Tended to be one or the other. And the frame of mind or the approach was, when it's a favorable period, that's when we're active. And if it's an unfavorable period, you sort of retreat in some way. But that's a complete undialectical approach, because if there's reaction in some countries or elements of reaction, well, we should know through dialectics that there's also a response to that reaction. That reaction is creating a response among certain layers of people who can be recruited to the Revolutionary Party on a higher level precisely because of the reaction. We often inside the organization want to establish norms of activity, attendance at activities each week, attendance at a branch meeting. And obviously, we're often very happy that somebody will attend an activity or somebody will attend a branch meeting. But sometimes the attendance at an activity or a meeting does not mean development, because what can also flow from that type of approach is a routineism. And routineism is essentially where people do things out of routine as opposed to conscious decision, conscious preparation, conscious involvement. Again, I don't want to be imbalanced here, but I used to have a problem when there was so much of a focus on we would do an activity and this is how much we raised. Now, before I get accosted by Stefan there, I'm in favor of raising as much money as possible on activities, but it's not the sole yardstick. The yardstick should be, how many contacts did we get? What's the nature of the contacts? What did they say? How more informed are we about the consciousness of young people, working class people, as a result of the activity? Let's politicize the work. Sorry, the point I'm making is that we need to try and, with new members, with ourselves, again and again, adopt a freshness, a political freshness. We need to break out of routine. Comrades would definitely accuse me in the Irish section of overthinking. I'm not sure about it. I'll have to think a bit more whether it's accurate. But there are comrades who, recently I've heard a comrade say that they're sort of a perfectionist. If you're a perfectionist, you won't survive in this organization. And if you're a perfectionist, the tendency is to be conservative and not to act until you feel an absolute state of preparedness. And whether it be a political question, whether it be a strategy, whether it be an organizational approach, you can only achieve so much on your own and in your own mind. And sometimes you aren't clear of exactly what to do, but sometimes you just need to engage and then learn on the basis of the experience, because ideas flow from experience in any case. Comrades are often very frustrated about their own development inside the organization. Comrades will join the organization, they'll attend a branch, and you'll often hear that the perception is, Jesus, everybody knows so much, this is unbelievable, I remember a comrade said to me once that it takes maybe about 5 years before somebody can become a cadre. Now, I don't agree with that. I think that that's an arbitrary figure just plucked from the air. But I think when people come around the organization, they see a developed set of politics and they see often a developed layer of people, and they think, I will never be like that. But that's because they're looking at it in an evolutionary linear way. How many years did it take for that person to become that? Whereas actually it can be much more explosive. Parties achieve breakthroughs, but sometimes individuals achieve breakthroughs in terms of their own development, quantity into quality. And one of the issues that does exist, in my opinion, and needs to be consciously thought about, is we shouldn't in any way not take young people seriously. Obviously, young people, but young people can develop very, very quickly. And it's not a question of overburdening people, but it's a question of trying to maximize the development and not have this slow evolutionary approach. Young people can become cadres. And the nature of young people is that they should be able to be very active. They should be able to read a lot because of the energy and all the key attributes that young people have. And so it should be a specific time of very significant development. And the ISA is only in the process of trying to establish its youth work. But if we're successful, well, then we'll have to invest a huge amount more in terms of developing young people. I'm just going to mention one other last aspect. I think that in the organization, comrades can often seek models or reference points to help them chart where we're at or what is the current political situation. You know, people need reference points. They need some sort of compass. You know, lots of comrades, in fact, many, possibly even a majority of people who join the organization will have, maybe not, but possibly a majority may have university education or third level. And there's, you know, modules and there's models and, you know, all sorts of ways in which people are trained, let's say, to look at things. But I think we have to be careful. I think Sophie made the point, I'll come back to it in a few minutes, but we have to be careful about models, even historic examples, because we can be imprisoned and be expecting, Sophie didn't, you know, but some comrades can expect a repetition, and there aren't going to be repetitions. And the key challenge is that we all need to try and analyze the current situation. That's where we really develop ourselves as Marxists. So I want to make some points about the broader questions that were raised. I think quantity into quality and the question of change of governments and those different aspects. I'm going to try and sort of bring them together maybe by an example. So, you know, in the modern era, most changes of government don't constitute any change of policy whatsoever, you know, in most people's experiences. I said at a recent meeting in Ireland that, you know, since over the last 40 years, there's been 16 changes of government and nobody thinks there's any change of policy whatsoever. But then you can have other occasions when a change of government does constitute a significant turning point. You just have to see the context, you have to see the impact. But this is linked with the concept of revolutions. There's different types of revolutions. And so, for example, you can have a change of government, or you can even have a political revolution. So you change the parties, possibly, you change the individuals who are ruling, but there's no social change. It's still the same capitalist system. So there's no, quantity hasn't changed into quality in the sense of capitalism hasn't been breached and socialism or a worker state has not been developed. And so the different forms of revolution are an example of quantitative change not leading to qualitative change, or in the case of social revolution as opposed to political revolution, if there's a social revolution, well, then there's a change in the base of society, change in the ownership in society. Sophie made the point about the lag between the objective conditions of very serious capitalist crisis and then the lag behind that of the consciousness of working class people and young people. And I think in a more developed way, that actually puts the task of propaganda on the ISA, more so than we have fully understood, I think. What propaganda being putting forward more developed ideas, more nuanced ideas to a smaller portion, not the mass necessarily, but certain layers in society. I think that there's undoubtedly a politicization, which is lesser than a radicalization. There is also a radicalization amongst certain layers, but it's not finished. And even people who have an anti-capitalist consciousness, they're then also naive about capitalism. They don't understand how rotten and cynical it is, and then they get knocked by it. So we actually have a role to play in trying to, with the more advanced layers, assist them, because there's a struggle at the moment to leap over, you know, because of bourgeois ideology, the confusion that exists. We have a role to play in helping people leap over and develop a socialist and a Marxist outlook. Now, many, in my opinion, like in the mix of the consciousness, for example, of young people, they're revolution, Marxism, socialism, all of these things are in the mix, but the conclusion is not being drawn at this point in a consistent way. We have a role to play in progressively bringing people over that barrier. I made a contribution in the discussion on world perspectives where I basically was pointing that, in my opinion, the ISA needs to look more at the root of society for possible explosions, which will be the motor of pushing forward radicalization and reorganization of the working class. So you could look at the situation in Latin America, for example, or you could look at the situation in other countries, and you see revolts are taking place, and then they are reflected by developments politically. But what they are reflected by are not qualitative breakthroughs, because in many countries, it's fundamentally the same reformism that existed previously. It's not a breakthrough in terms of a real representation of the essence of the explosions from below, which have a revolutionary character. The political reflection is just another form of reformism, which isn't able to move the situation forward. And so I would say, in that sense, that's an example of quantity not being transformed into quality yet, internationally even. In my opinion, in many, many countries, there's a basis for a feminist movement to become established, but they've not become established as movements in the way in which we understand them to be movements. They haven't fully crystallized and become factors. And it's the same in regard to the youth movements. They're in the way in which there were youth movements which became established, became things. It hasn't crystallized yet, but I think both of these can, as well as workers' movements and new parties, all of this can happen, but it hasn't really happened yet of a new quality. And I've mentioned Sophie a few times, and I think added to the contribution a lot, but I just want to go into things a little bit more, because sometimes, for example, in terms of in Ireland, repeal and the achievement of abortion did not flow from a mass struggle, actually. And this is all about judgment, because I would say 15 now was achieved, but not on the basis of mass struggle. So again, dialectically, we have to have a sense of society. And in Ireland, in regard to abortion rights, we channeled a sentiment and semi-mass mobilizations, but not a mass movement, but it was enough to achieve the breakthrough. And it's something similar in regard to 15 now. I'm not making the argument against mass movements. I'm in favor of mass movements, but sometimes you can achieve things in advance of the mass movement, depending on the balance of forces. This is all about quantity, quality. And if a revolutionary party achieves these type of things, it can position itself then for the greater explosions. So we're not just preparing for mass explosions, etc. We're seizing any opportunities along the way, and dialectics plays a huge part in that. And the last 2 points I'll just make is we have to really appreciate materialism in the sense that we have to understand that we are all massively affected by what we experience every day. And we need to be conscious of that, because, we're not conscious of it. We think we're okay, we're just getting on with things, etc. But we are affected in so many different ways by everything that's happening. And we have to be very, very conscious of that. Obviously, there's an increase in authoritarian rule and a pushback on democratic rights. But the main breaker of revolutionary movements is not necessarily repression, but it's the pressure of bourgeois ideology demoralizing people politically, knocking people back. And how many times have we experienced that the sense of a layer of comments is that nothing is changing, it's just the same, it's a repetition. This is so often so common, but that sentiment is so un-Marxist. It's the first thing, about Marxism, it's everything is changing. So it's quite a common refrain amongst comrades. Nothing is changing, you know what I mean, in a Marxist organization. And the reference to TDU is appropriate. I think the loss of the comrades was very unfortunate. I think that there's many good comrades in that grouping, but unfortunately, because of the credibility and the authority of some of the leading people, lots of people left the organization under a false leadership, essentially, unfortunately. I'm talking about of TDU, obviously. But formal logic was also a key problem there, because in my experience in the discussions with Tidu, the line of argument was a formal logic line of argument. One of them, obviously, but what they said basically, they had the negative perspective, and what they said was the next period will be setbacks and defeats, and the reason is because there's an absence of left parties. And that was based on their experience, because Syriza, as a left party, sold out in 2015 when the mass of people wanted to fight the EU, wanted to fight capitalism, but they just sold out. You know, they got a referendum, they got a result, and then they sold it out within a week. And the conclusion of the comrades was a paradoxical conclusion that you can't move forward unless you have a left party. But even if you did have a left party, it could do exactly the same as Syriza all over again. So the comrades were, their demoralization was compounded. But then at the same time, the comrades in Tidu did not have any orientation in reality to the women's movement, to the feminist movement, to the youth movements that were taking place. In other words, where the recovery was already taking place, the comrades were caught in the cul-de-sac of their own formal logic. I think that the period we're in has similarities to the 1930s, but one of the differences I think is important. In the 1930s, reaction was quite developed, and reaction was quite developed on the basis of a whole series of previous major defeats of the working class. I feel that reaction in many countries has more of a momentum than the working class movement at this point in time. I think that that's true. But there are also major limitations to reaction at this point in time. And just to finish, I think there's also similarities between or with the period just after 1914, between 1914 and 1917. And this deals with the point that again, Sophie mentioned, because post 1914, you didn't really you had social democracy, but it had sold out by what they did in the war. So in reality, the working class didn't have organizations politically that were representing them. And that's the sort of volatility that I think exists at the present moment in time. There's a basis for world war in a sense. There's a huge economic crisis. And there aren't organizations that are representing working class people. And you have this turmoil and this explosive volatility. And in this period, we should take ourselves fully seriously. We should remind ourselves that dialectically, when there is an explosion, that you don't have the slow pace of incremental changes in consciousness of the mass of people in periods of explosions or periods of revolution. Consciousness leaps forward. And essentially, I think the rhythm of things will be towards explosion. So the opportunity, explosive outbursts, revolts, revolutions, we can build very strong revolutionary parties, even from small bases, but we can also play a broader role in terms of reorganizing, helping to reorganize the working class, feminist movements, youth movements, and put the working class in a much stronger position. And I think in order to seize that, I think, again, taken from what Lenin done in 1914, 1915, in terms of redeveloping and deepening his understanding of Hegel and dialectics, we should do the same, because understanding dialectics will help us to be prepared for the period that we're going into. That's it. Thanks.